Good afternoon, everyone. We're here in DeKalb County. It's Auburn, Indiana. It's 20 miles north of Fort Wayne, Indiana. But here's Andrew King and myself, Dewey Davenport. You guys seen us before. And if you haven't, you're going to see us today. So today we got a treat. We're going to talk about a Fokker D-VII. Andrew's going to do a walk around. I'm going to do most of the videoing. But we've been up here doing what?
Shoot, that's about my third or fourth test flight, something like that, on the airplane. I had some time on it when we started flying it, but it still needed a little bit of evaluation and had a little bit of a squawk list we had to write up for things that need to be done.
That's right. We're up here test flying a Fokker D-VII for a guy that had it built, custom made. Andrew will talk about it a little bit more, but let's get to it, Andrew. I'm going to switch the camera around so you guys can enjoy this Fokker D-VII.
We're here in Auburn, Indiana with this beautiful airplane. It's a replica of a 1918 Fokker D-VII. Fokker D-VII was one of the best known airplanes of World War I, one of the best airplanes of World War I. They were used by other air forces, the Dutch Air Force and other air forces up, I think, into the 1930s, but well after World War I, because it was such a good airplane. Anthony Fokker was a Dutchman, and this legend has it he offered his services to the British before World War I, and they didn't want him, so he went to the Germans. I'm not sure that's quite true. I think he had German connections already. Had been designing airplanes that were flown in Germany and stuff. But when World War I came, he had the Fokker Aircraft Company, and they made airplanes for the German Air Force, whatever it was called at that point. This was possibly his best airplane. He also had a Fokker D-VIII monoplane that was a little bit later, but wasn't much of a factor in the war. But there were hundreds of these built. Lots of the German aces flew these. Has a reputation for being easy to fly as far as World War I airplanes go, and it's, in my opinion, it's very true. It's much easier to fly than a lot of World War I airplanes. The technological innovations in this airplane compared to the average World War I airplane are many. The structure itself, the fuselage is made of a steel tube truss. It's kind of a ladder, a steel tube ladder on four sides, and then there's wires that brace each square bay. But the idea of using steel tube as a primary structure was very unique and very new in World War I. Fokker was an innovator as far as welding. Now, in the 30s and 40s, almost all airplanes had a welded steel tube fuselage structure like that. So Fokker was way ahead of the game on that. The other interesting thing is the wings. Normally the wings on a World War I airplane, you'll look at it and you'll see bracing wires going all over the place. No bracing wires on it. These are cantilever wings. In theory, you could take this bottom wing off, it would probably fly in the top wing all by itself. But there's no bracing required. The spars are giant box spars. They're about a couple inches thick. They actually taper as they go out towards the tip. The thickness of the wing tapers. It's quite a complicated wing design, really, but very strong. I looped it today for the first time. 3 times I looped it today, so I tested the strength a little bit. But these cantilever wings are very unusual for a World War I airplane also. Really unusual until the 1930s, cantilever wings. There was a few, obviously, but it was, again, a very innovative thing. The wing struts out here, supposedly they're not even really necessary because the wings will support themselves, but they flex a little bit, and the pilots didn't like it, so they put the struts out here to help keep the wings from flexing, more to keep the pilots comfortable than for any real structural reason. So that's kind of the technical stuff. All right, let's talk a little bit about the differences between this particular airplane and an original Fokker D-VII from 1918 from World War I. The engine is the main difference. The original engine was a Mercedes engine, 6-cylinder, around 1,000 cubic inches. Early in the war, I think they were 120 horsepower pretty quick. They went to 160, 180. They had 200 horsepower ones at the end of the war. But it's a big engine, 200 in today's terms. 200 horsepower is not much for a 1,000 cubic inch engine. But it was a high torque engine, long stroke, turned a great big propeller. I think the top RPM was maybe only around 1,400 or 1,500 RPM, something like that. So low RPM, high torque engine. They're very hard to find. If you're a millionaire, you might be able to find an original Mercedes engine for your Fokker D-VII. Anybody else that builds one has to come up with some kind of substitute. The American Ranger engine will work. The more modern engines, they flipped them around though and put the cylinders sticking down. In World War I, they had the crankshaft and crankcase in the bottom, cylinders sticking up. So to make it work, in a Ranger or this Gypsy Queen engine, you have to flip it around and put the cylinders up and changes the oil system. You have to make modifications in the carburation. It complicates things in a way, but they're available. So this engine is a British-built Gypsy Queen 6-cylinder engine. They were used on a number of British airplanes, Dragon Rapides, a lot of airplanes in the 40s and 50s used the Gypsy Queen engine. There were various variants, supercharged and geared and stuff. This is an fairly early model, non-supercharged, non-geared, 6-cylinder. It's about, I believe, 550 cubic inches. And so, you know, a little more than half of the original. It makes me wonder, flying this, what it would be like to fly one with a Mercedes, because it would have a lot more kick to it. But it's a British engine, German airplane being flown by American pilots. And so far it's worked okay. One of the unusual things about it, and kind of a typical British thing, the propeller spins a different way than American airplanes and most of the airplanes built pretty much anywhere in the world. For some reason the British like to have propellers that went the other way around. And so that changes on takeoff. You need left rudder instead of right rudder. Changes a few of the other things. The exhaust comes out on this side so that the slipstream is kind of pushing it down away from the pilot a little bit, where the exhaust on the original airplane came out on the right side on this other side here. So that's one of the differences in this airplane. The other difference is, because in the modern environment we have to operate off of pavement usually, and in World War I they exclusively flew off grass fields. This airplane has brakes on the wheels. The wheels are pretty close to the authentic size and everything, but these disc brakes are an addition. Really a safety addition and a practicality addition to make it more useful in the modern environment. And then you'll see at the back end of the fuselage, originally there was just a skid, a wooden ash piece that stuck out of the bottom of the fuselage and had bungees springing it at the top, and then it just had a steel shoe at the bottom of it to drag in the grass and help slow you down. They didn't have any brakes in World War I. So it was just the skid in the back that slowed you down. So this has wheels with brakes, and it has a steerable tail wheel on the back end so that it's more usable, so we can actually land it on pavement. And that's really about all the difference. Other than that, it's a very authentic recreation of a 1918 Fokker D-VII.
How does it fly?
Well,
give us some flying characteristics.
Again, it's compared. I tell people that World War I airplanes, 90% of them, they're tail heavy. You have to hold the stick forward all the time, and the ailerons are heavy, and the elevator and rudder work pretty well. The stall characteristics of some of the World War I airplanes, typically a World War I airplane has a very thin airfoil, which tends to have a sharp stall, easily go into a spin. This has these big flat wings. It was another Fokker innovation, these fat high lift wings. It flies, it's very docile compared to most World War I airplanes. The stall is pretty docile. It doesn't tend to break or snap into a spin or anything. It was good for the German Air Force at the end of World War I because they were short on pilots, they were short on everything as they were losing the war, and a new pilot, they could have a pilot with 20 or 30 hours in him, 20 or 30 flying hours, and put him in a Fokker D-VII and he could fly it successfully. So that was one of the advantages of it, was that it is fairly easy to fly. The nose is a little bit longer than a lot of World War I airplanes, helps it balance a little bit better. So it's compared to now a modern airplane, the ailerons are heavier, they do work slower, the controls are not harmonized, the rudder and elevator work much better than the aileron. But for a World War I airplane, this was the F-14 or F-15 of World War I airplanes. Yeah, a couple of cosmetic or looks things that are interesting, typical of Fokkers and a number of airplanes in World War I, is this scallop trailing edge. If you look, the trailing edge curves in between each of the main wing ribs. All it is a wire. Everything they did in World War I was about lightness, because they had learned in the pioneer era, when they didn't have high horsepower engines, that saving every pound they could made the airplane fly better. So the trailing edge is just a piece of wire, and when the fabric shrinks up, it pulls it into this distinctive scallop look. The other interesting thing is these balances, aerodynamic balances. The elevators and rudder, you can see, have a balance area forward of the hinge. This part of the elevator, this part of the rudder. It catches the air more than if the hinge just went straight up and it was just bending against the wind. This tends to catch the air more and make it more effective and make it a little bit lighter on the controls for the pilot. The ailerons have the same thing. One interesting thing that part of later history, but these overhang, we call them elephant ears. It's kind of a colloquialism, an American colloquialism from the 1920s. But you'll see them on a number of different airplanes, and one of the interesting things, especially for us, is that there's quite a lot of Fokker D-VII in the Traveler biplane that we fly, that we give rides in. The steel tube fuselage was a bit innovative when Traveler started in 1925. They don't have cantilever wings, but they do have ailerons like this with the overhang on it. The rudder is sort of a similar shape. And the Travelers, in fact, when they were making movies in Hollywood in the 1920s, and they didn't have enough of these, there were a few of these around in America because the U.S. Army actually had a few after the war, but not enough for a Hollywood squadron. They'd use Travelers, and they got the nickname Wichita Fokker because they have a certain resemblance to a Fokker D-VII. But so that's one of the interesting aerodynamic things is the balances, the aerodynamic balances on the control surfaces. All right, this is the cockpit of the Fokker D-VII. There's a few interesting things. The Germans were not very much into instruments in World War I. All German airplanes had a tachometer. It was a little bit bigger than this. This is a modern tachometer. It's in the correct place. Fokker actually had an instrument board, instrument panel. A lot of the German airplanes did not. They usually had a compass on the floor and the tachometer, and sometimes the pilot would wear a wrist altimeter strapped to his wrist, and that was about it. If they had a stationary engine like this one, they'd have oil pressure and oil temperature gauges, fuel valves and stuff. These are modern gauges in this, but they're roughly in the correct position. And then if you look on the floor, you can see the rudder control is by rudder bar instead of separate pedals, sort of like a sled, your old flexible flyer sled. And the stick has the triggers on it. This isn't exactly the correct stick either, but it's fairly close. It has the two little triggers to actuate the machine guns right from the stick, so you don't have to take your hand off the stick. Throttle on the left-hand side. Again, it's not an authentic throttle, but it's in the correct position. Of course, the guns were mounted right here. There were two machine guns, Spandau machine guns. I believe they were 9mm machine guns, pretty effective. And Fokker was one of the pioneers also in synchronizing or interrupting the guns. The guns had to fire through the propeller, of course, and that was a big problem in the beginning of World War I until they finally figured out a mechanical way to hook the engine up to the guns so that they wouldn't fire when the propeller was in front of the gun. And Fokker was kind of an innovator in that, but they started out with interrupters that would stop the gun from firing when the prop was there, and eventually came up with synchronizers so that it would synchronize the rate of fire with the propeller so you wouldn't hit your own propeller with your guns. Fuel gauges right here. There's a big fuel tank right under in front of the windshield there. I think it holds, what did we say, 23 gallons, something like that. Patrols were fairly short. They rarely flew 2-hour patrols, but they would fly as high as 20,000 feet in airplanes like this, which is hard to imagine. The windshield, you can see, is very rudimentary. It doesn't do much. You get a lot of wind in here. You really need your goggles to fly it. But very functional, a lot of stuff in your face. If you crash a Fokker D-VII, you're probably going to lose some teeth. But comfortable, roomy, and you knew you were in a good airplane when you were sitting in a Fokker D-VII.
All right, so that's kind of wrapped up our walk around Andrew just did on the Fokker D-VII. We'll maybe give you a little history on the paint scheme from I guess the German fighter. This is an actual paint scheme from World War I. This was really my first fighter. Back in October, I flew a standard J1, which is 1917 U.S. airplane trainer. But this is the first time I've got to really actually fly a fighter. Andrew, how about you? What's your experience with flying World War I?
I kind of grew up around World War I airplanes. I grew up at the old Rhinebeck Aerodrome in New York, in upstate New York, about 100 miles north of New York City, and they had quite a few of these kind of airplanes that they did air shows in. They still do every weekend, all summer. So I kind of grew up around them. I flew a Fokker triplane when I was 20 years old. That was kind of the start, and I've flown Fokkers and Sopwiths. I've flown about, I think, 11 different types of World War I aircraft. And the D-VII is probably top 2 or 3 as far as capabilities and flying qualities and general how good an airplane it is.
Well, he gives you a lot of experience, and also he gives you a good recommendation. So the Fokker D-VII is pretty awesome. Flying it, for me, it is a lot different, but it does fly like an antique airplane. If you've flown old antiques, they aren't really balanced out perfectly, but they still do fly. You have to fly the airplane quite a bit, pretty constant. You're always moving stuff around, and this is no different. So I really enjoyed it, learning this Gypsy Queen engine. We're both kind of learning some of the ins and outs, and just trying to figure out, what's the best power setting and things like that. So hopefully in the next month or two, we'll know more about it, and we'll let you guys know, or let everyone know, and kind of go from there. So
Onward and upward.
yeah, hopefully you'll see it at a fly-in, or maybe Oshkosh.
At an event near you.
Yeah, we plan on taking it to Wright Pat, to the Dawn Patrol at Wright Pat this year. So if you guys are around, come on out and visit us. Okay, until then, blue skies.